Hi there, welcome to Practical Spirituality, our class on Tanya. We are on chapter 48 of Likutei Amarim. We finished chapter 47 with the consideration that God took us out of Egypt, and that doesn't just mean the actual physical location of Egypt, or even the concept of slavery in the literal sense, but the Hebrew word for Egypt is related to the Hebrew word for limitations, and therefore God takes us out of our limitations in serving Him and connecting to Him. For that reason, the verse that concludes the entirety of the Shema, where we attest our devotion to Him and to His commandments and to the Torah, is all about God taking us out of Egypt, because we should leave those limitations in connection to our service of God. Once we finish that in the last chapter, this chapter begins with the fact that we have to contemplate what that means for us to reciprocate that kind of love back to God. Contemplating on the greatness of the blessed Ein Sof, on the infinite aspect of God. Ein Sof means no end. The intelligent person will realize that as his name indicates, so is he. No end. There is no end or limit or finitude at all to the light and vitality that diffuse from him. The reason that he takes us beyond our limitations is because he himself doesn't have any limitations. There is no end or limit or finitude at all to the light and vitality that diffuse from him. May he be blessed by his simple will, and which is united with his blessed essence and being in perfect unity. His simple will, the idea of simple in this case doesn't mean basic or small, but rather not complex or not caused by anything else. No components involved. There are certain things that a person may want based on circumstances. A simple will is just because. There is no reason per se. Just essentially because that's what the person wants, or in this case, that's what God wants. God chose us of a simple will. He takes us out of our limitations, out of a simple will. He wants that there should be a world out of a simple will to have a dwelling place in the lowest of realms. Had the worlds descended from the light of the blessed Ein Sof, of the infinite aspect of God, without contractions, that is to say, without a qualitative change from infinity to finitude, but according to a gradual descent from grade to grade by means of cause and effect. Cause and effect are related to each other, hence one can cause and one is the effect. This world would not, in such case, have ever been created in the present form in a finite and limited order. Obviously, infinity can never really go into finitude without a qualitative change. If it's just a quantitative change, there's never going to be a way for the world itself to appear and to be limited. The next couple of lines are going to be examples of limitation or finitude in creation, even in the spiritual realms. For example, from the earth to heaven, there being a journey of 500 years. And the number isn't important. The fact that there is a number, which is a particular amount, means it's a limited amount. And similarly, between heaven and heaven, and so also the diameter of each heaven, even the world to come and the supreme Garden of Eden, meaning the spiritual realms, the habitation of the souls of the great tzaddikim, of the righteous, and the souls themselves, and needless to add, the angels are all in the realm of bounds and limitations. For there is a limit to their apprehension of the light of the blessed Ein Sof, of the infinite aspect of God, which shines on them through being clothed in Chabad, etc., in the intellectual attributes. It's worthwhile to note that here when we say the souls themselves, we're not talking about the souls at their essence. The soul at its essence is literally a part of God that's not limited, just like God himself is without limit. The souls that here we're referring to is the soul beyond its essence when it's ready to go into a body, or in this case, having already been in a body. The habitation of the souls of the great tzaddikim means the souls of those righteous that lived and served God in the world that have now ascended on high. The fact, for example, that there are levels of angels, 10 layers, 10 levels that are described, for example, by Maimonides, means that each one of them is limited. Otherwise, there couldn't be a hierarchy. The fact that there's a particular one that's higher or lower means that all of them are somehow limited. Hence, There is also a boundary to their enjoyment derived from the splendor of the divine presence, and to their pleasure in the light of God, for they cannot absorb enjoyment and delight of an infinite order without being nullified out of their existence and return to their source. That's also why the angels, for example, say, holy, holy, holy. The idea of holiness is separation. God is up there, as it were, and they are down here, in the sense that he's infinite and they're finite. Of course, they have a great revelation of spirituality, much more so than in this world, but nevertheless, it is a limited revelation. Now, as for the intricate details of the contractions, this is not the place for their explanation. Tanya is about how and why to serve God, not academic analysis and a lot of kind of nitty-gritty, as it were. But in general, they are something in the nature of occultation and concealment of the flow of the light and vitality, so that only an extremely minute portion of light and vitality should illuminate and reach the lower creatures in a revealed manner, as it were, pervading them and acting in them and animating them, so that they might receive existence ex nihilo, something from nothing, and be in a state of finitude and limitation. Were it more than this very, very tiny blip or tiny little kind of drop of this infinite light, we would have a nullification of their limits. We would have a world that itself is not concealing divinity, not finite. And the reason why God wants that the world should be finite and should conceal divinity is so that there should be genuine service of God through free choice. But that can only happen if I have a genuine choice. So in front of me is two plates, one kosher food, one not kosher food. They both look like food. They both taste like food. But I have to choose one over the other, the kosher one over the not kosher. If we had no concealment of divinity, I would see the food that's kosher as actual food, and the food that's not kosher as poison, and it would be no choice at all. It would be a no-brainer. No service of God at that point at all, and that's not why God created the world. So, an example that, or analogy that we could look at as far as how this works is, imagine a power plant with its almost infinite amount of electricity that it produces to my wall outlet. If I were to plug my fan into the power plant, it would explode. It would be overwhelmed by the surge of electricity. But when that amount of electricity that's coming out of the power plant goes through all the different steps that eventually brings it into my wall outlet, then the fan can function correctly and everything works the way that it should. In a similar way, though a little bit more than that, as we'll see soon, in a similar way is the infinite light of God, as it gets concealed and constricted until we have a little bit that comes into a finite world in order to create it and animate it. This constitutes an exceedingly contracted illumination, and it is considered as virtually nothing at all compared with the quality of the limitless and infinite illumination. And there's no reference or relationship between them, as the term reference is understood in values, where the figure 1 has a relevancy with the number 1 million, for it is 1/millionth part of it. But as regards a thing which is in the realm of infinity, there's no number that can be considered relative to it, for a billion or trillion do not attain the relevancy of the figure 1 in comparison with a billion or a trillion, but is veritably accounted as nothing. Infinity is not within the realm of numbers, and therefore within the realm of numbers you have more or less, etc. But once you're at infinity, there's nothing to compare to within numbers at all. It's a qualitative distinction, not a quantitative one. It's for this reason, by the way, that we can genuinely say there is none other than God. There's none other than Him, Ein Od Milvado. Anything that exists isn't actually existing. It's completely dependent and fully nullified in comparison to the infinity of God. So indeed is the quality of the contracted illumination which informs the higher and lower worlds, acting in them and animating them. Higher meaning even the spiritual realms, compared with the quality of the hidden and concealed light that is of an infinite order and does not clothe itself or exercise its influence in the worlds to animate them in a revealed manner, but it encompasses them from above and is called Sevev Kol Olmin, the encompasser of all worlds. So there are basically two ways that God relates to the world. One is filler of all worlds, and one is encompasser of all worlds. Filler of all worlds considers each particular creation, each aspect of the world and its capacity for divine revelation, and gives it no less and no more than what it can handle. For full involvement, no less and not more, so that it remains a created, limited being and doesn't get overwhelmed and nullified. Encompasser of all worlds disregards any particulars, no parameters, no limitations. It is infinite and therefore cannot go into that particular created entity with its particular capacity. We can think of it as the difference between filling a cup of water versus throwing a cup of water into, or a cup, into a river or into a lake. When we fill the cup of water, there's a particular capacity of that cup. If we fill it all the way to the top without spilling, we have filled it to its capacity. That's a particular amount of water. Bigger cup, more water. Smaller cup, less water. We don't want to spill. We don't want to lose any, waste any space. So we have to be very particular and measure out the amount of water given the size of the cup. That's filler of all worlds. What we're discussing is if we take that same cup or those same cups of different size and throw them into the lake. Technically, there's water in the open area of the cup, but nobody looks at it that way. Rather, you're looking at the cup as it is engulfed by this amount of water outside of it, that is the lake. And even though the lake has a particular amount of water, in the context of that cup, it may as well be infinite. And because it may as well be infinite, it doesn't matter whether it's a bigger cup, a smaller cup. No water is really filling the cup. The cup is being surrounded or encompassed by the water. The meaning of this is not that it encircles and encompasses from above spatially, God forbid, for in spiritual matters, the category of space is in no way applicable. Again, we use the example of the cup being thrown into the water, and so the water is spatially surrounding it. But here we're talking about God, and so that's, of course, where the analogy breaks down. But the meaning is that it encircles and encompasses from above insofar as the so-called revealed influence is concerned. For influence, which is in the category of revelation in the worlds, is referred to as investiture, being clothed within the worlds. Now, clothing has a size, and it has a size for a reason. It's based on the size, the parameters of the person wearing it. That's not what we're talking about as far as God's infinite relationship with the world. For the influence that they receive is clothed and comprehended by them. Whereas the influence which does not come within the category of revelation, the one that we're talking about here, but remains in occultation and concealment and is not apprehended by the world because it transcends their parameters, is not described as being invested, but as encircling and encompassing. Therefore, since the worlds belong in the order of the finite and limited, it follows that only an extremely minute and contracted, meaning qualitatively less, reflection of the flow of the light of blessed Ein Sof, of this infinite light, clothes and reveals itself in them in a revealed form, and this only to animate them in a finite and limited state. Again, were it any more than this, their finite and limited state would be nullified, and then everything would be revealed in the world, and we would no longer have free choice, no longer have service of God. But the principal light, without contraction to such an extent, is called encircler and encompasser, since its influence is not revealed within them, inasmuch as they belong in the order of the finite and the limited. Now, the reality is that because God does both are needed. There is, of course, the second aspect, not the one that we're emphasizing and explaining here. There is that aspect where God encloses himself. Then there's obviously the aspect where God encompasses. It's necessary because God is neither relegated to infinity nor relegated to being involved in the finite world. He has to be both if he's truly infinite, truly unlimited. So as far as being infinite in relationship to a finite world, he's only encompassing, like the water that surrounds the cup. As far as being involved in the world, he's obviously enclosing or imbuing himself into that particular entity, into that creation in the world, like water filling the capacity of the cup. Imagine being at work and hearing a general announcement versus having a private conversation with the boss. Both have an upside and a downside, therefore both are necessary. The general announcement is much more powerful because it's for everyone. At the same time, it's not tailored to you because it's for everyone. When you have a private conversation, there you have a feeling of closeness with the boss. That's the upside. The downside is it's obviously not as much of a splash because it's just a private conversation between you and the boss. To illustrate this point, consider this material world. Even though the whole world is full of his glory, we'll note that that's not him, but rather his glory, his emanation, not quite him. Namely, the light of the blessed Ein Sof, the infinite aspect of God, as it is written, do not I fill heaven and earth, says the Lord. Now, in this case, that's not just glory or emanation, it's actually him as the source of that glory or emanation. Nevertheless, only a very small vitality of the category of inanimate and vegetable worlds is clothed therein in the form of revealed influence. We're specifically choosing inanimate and vegetation because they are the lower two of the overall four categories of creation. Remember, overall four categories of creation is inanimate objects, vegetation, animals, human being. So the lower of the two, inanimate objects, not alive at all. Vegetation, at least they don't move around, though they are alive. They have the smallest little bit of that infinite light, lest they be overwhelmed. While all the light of the blessed Ein Sof is termed as encompassing it, even though it actually pervades it, since its influence is no more revealed in it, but is active in it in a hidden and concealed manner. And any influence of a concealed nature is referred to as encircling from above, for the hidden world is on a higher plane than the revealed world. Simply speaking, it's something that is too high to be revealed, therefore it's hidden. Very similar to how a father, when he explains a concept to his young child, he'll explain a very small bit of what he himself knows about the concept, because if he were to tell the child what he knows, that would be too much. That would overwhelm the intellect of the child. So he keeps the majority to himself, encircling, as it were, and imbues to the child just a little bit that the child can handle in order to understand the concept. The same thing is with God's life force. Let us make it more intelligible by means of an example. What are we trying to explain further? How is it that we can have within the world and also outside of the world God's influence at the same time? Seemingly it's either or, not both at the same time, and here we say that it is both at the same time. When a man forms an image in his mind of something that he has seen or sees, in other words, imagine an image that you just saw. Although the entire body and essence of that thing, both its exterior and interior and its very core, are completely mirrored in his mind and thought, for he has seen it or is seeing it in its entirety, this is expressed by saying that his mind encompasses that object completely, and that thing is enveloped by his mind and thought. I am grasping an idea, right? Not physically, not literally. Figuratively, my mind is grasping whatever object it is. But it is not encompassed in actual fact. In other words, my brain isn't, grabbing something. Only in the imagination of the man's thought and mind. The Holy One, blessed be he, however, of whom it is written, for my thoughts are not your thoughts. And the next verse there says, just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so too are my thoughts higher than yours. In other words, qualitatively different. Surely his thought and mind, knowing all created things, encompass each and every created being from its beginning to its end, and its inside and very core, all in actual reality. Remember, God is omnipresent. He's also omnipotent. Therefore, and there's nothing other than him. So therefore, whereas my brain is in one place, and the object that I'm imagining is in a different place, and therefore my brain can't literally grasp that object and only figuratively grasps the idea of that object, God is everywhere and there's nothing other than him. So he actually encompasses literally that object. For example, in the case of the orb of this earth, the globe, his blessed knowledge encompasses the entire diameter of the globe of the earth, together with all that is in it and its deepest interior to its lowest depth, all in actual reality, not figuratively. For this knowledge constitutes the vitality of the whole spherical thickness of the earth and its creation, ex nihilo, something from nothing. However, it would not have come into being as it is now, as a finite and limited thing, with an exceedingly minute vitality sufficient for the categories of inorganic matter and vegetation, were it not for the many powerful contractions which have condensed the light and vitality that is clothed in the orb of the earth, so as to animate it and sustain it in its finite and limited status, and in the categories of inorganic and vegetable matter alone. The same lack of comparison that prevents an infinite life force to fill a limited world, therefore requires that the infinite only surround that finite earth. But his blessed knowledge, which is united with his essence and being, for he is the knowledge, the knower, and the known, all three elements are involved in the concept of knowing. The knowledge is the material. The knower is the knowledge is the ability to know. The knower is the person who's knowing, and the known is the material, is the information. With God, he is all three at once because there's nothing other than him. And knowing himself, as it were, he knows all created things because they are within him. There's nothing outside of it, but not with the knowledge that is external to himself, like the knowledge of a human being. For all of them, the created things, are derived from his blessed reality, and this thing is not within the power of human beings to comprehend clearly, as Maimonides says, but we basically have to take it on faith to at some extent, at some point, and so forth. Skip the note. This knowledge, since it is of an infinite order, is not described as clothing itself in the orb of the earth, because that again would be limited. This is infinite, which is finite and limited, but as encircling and encompassing it, although this knowledge embraces its entire thickness and interior in actual reality, thus giving it existence ex nihilo, something from nothing, as explained elsewhere. In other words, when we consider God's infinity, again, that means that God is not precluded or relegated in any way. So at the same time as God is too infinite, as it were, to enclose his infinity into a finite world, at the very same time, that infinity grasps or surrounds, literally, the physical realm. See you for chapter 49.